Good morning. Ms Graham, who's the witness this morning?
The witness this morning is Amanda Givan.
Good morning, Ms Givan. You're going to be asked questions by Ms Graham, whom you've already met. But before that, I'll put you on oath, so if you raise your hand, please. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but
the
truth.
truth.
Ms Graham.
Good morning.
Morning.
You're Amanda Givan.
I am, yes.
What age are you, Miss
I'm
Givan?
49.
And how many years service do you
Just
have?
about to complete 30 years service.
And you're going to retire later this year?
Friday is my last working day, yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Glad we got you here today.
Just in time.
You've given an inquiry statement to us,
yes.
And it's very detailed.
Yep.
And you've given a lot of details for the chair to consider about your police career and your SPF career. So we'll be able to come to that. But can I refer you to the black folder in front of you? And I want to make sure you've got everything you need.
Okay.
So let's look at that inquiry statement for a moment. It's SBPI 00072. And you'll see, first page, you'll see that's your statement, Tuesday the 31st of March and the 12th of April 2022 it was taken.
Yep.
And that was by a member of the inquiries team.
Yes.
And then if we can look at the final paragraph, 220.
Yep.
You're getting there quicker than we are.
Yeah.
And you'll see that the final paragraph says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website.
That's right, yeah.
And you understand that that's the case.
Yeah.
And then you've signed all the pages of your statement.
Yeah, I've signed every page.
Now, we don't have your signature on the screen. It's been redacted, but your hard copy has
It's on every
signature.
page, yeah.
And that was signed on the 2nd of May.
It was, yes.
Thank you. And let me look also at PERC 00237. And you'll see that this is a statement, and it was prepared by you, as I understand it. It's not dated, but if we look at paragraphs 105 and 107 of your inquiry statement, so there's going to be a little bit of juggling around, 105 and 107, you say that...
yeah. Provide the dates there.
107, please. And you talk about preparing your statement. And then at 108, you talk about D.I. Wilson contacting you by email as PERC had approached. So can you just explain it maybe quite simply to the chair how these statements came to be prepared?
So, yeah, the initial statement, the PERC...
the undated one.
237. I was asked to prepare that by a detective inspector who I think had in turn had been asked by PERC to contact me to provide that. So I created a statement. I'd never been asked for a statement for this kind of thing before, so I really wasn't sure, having not been involved in the incident, what they were looking for. So I provided I typed up a statement and I emailed it to him. And quite clearly I've not put the date on the actual document, but I had the date that I had sent it, if that makes sense. So that,
do you remember when you prepared that first statement?
On the day that he asked me for it,
do you remember when that was?
I typed it. Do you know, actually, it was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night that I sent it away, that whatever date that I've said.
Right. And then, can you look at 238? And this is another statement prepared. Now, this one was prepared on the 22nd of June 2015.
Yeah, so I was interviewed by PERC in respect to this statement. So this statement is put together from questions that they specifically asked me
And that was in the offices of PBW Law in Glasgow?
Yes. Yeah.
And it was Senior Investigator John McSporran who interviewed you?
It was.
In the presence of DSI Brian Dodds and Peter Watson, who's a solicitor?
Yeah.
So the first statement, I think you said, was about the 29th of May.
Yeah.
And you said that in your inquiry statement. And that was prepared by you by email and sent by email.
Yeah.
And the second statement that we have, 238, was dated the 22nd of June, 2015. And that was in response to questions from PERC investigators.
That's right, yeah.
Thank you. And then we've looked at your inquiry statement, and that was taken by a member of the inquiry team.
By you, yeah.
Person sitting next to you. And in all of these statements, is it fair to say you've tried to give your best recollection, a true and accurate account?
As best I could, yes.
As best you could. And you've signed your inquiry statement, you've already told us.
Yep.
You won't have signed the email version. Do you remember if you signed the PERC statement?
I think I will have signed the original, yes. Yeah. Obviously not the typed copy that you have here, but the original manuscript copy, I will have signed that.
And was that after you'd either read it over or be given a chance to, or had it read over to you?
I think it was read over to me, and
you were
I signed
happy
it at that
with
point.
it?
Yeah,
and signed it. And I think in paragraph 116 of your inquiry statement, you say that my memory would be better when I gave those statements than it is now. Is that the PERC and the email statement that you did?
Yeah, and I think any statement that you give closer to the incident is bound to be more accurate than 7 years later.
And you say if there's a discrepancy between my statements and my inquiry statement, I would prefer to know what the discrepancy is in order to give a view on that. It depends what it is.
Yeah, I was asked specifically whether I would prefer the earlier versions to be taken as the accepted. Well, it depends what the discrepancy would be.
Yeah, but generally, you think your memory was probably better.
Probably better,
then.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we'll go through a few things today. Can I ask you first of all about SPF, Scottish Police Federation?
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, in terms of your role within the SPF, and I'll take, this is paragraphs 3 to 7 of your inquiry statement, but I'll just run through this quite quickly. You've been a member since you joined the police in 1992.
Yeah.
That's at paragraph 3.
Yep.
And is it right that all constables are automatically members of the SPF?
Yes.
And then you were elected as a local SPF representative after about 10 years.
That's right.
Paragraph 4. And then you were elected as a full-time office bearer in 2012.
That's correct.
And you've been in that role, you were in that role in May 2015.
I was, yes.
So you were a local representative for the SPF.
I was a full-time office bearer in 2015 at the time of this incident.
Right. And you're on a full-time secondment, and originally it was with Fife Constabulary, but then in April 2013 it became Police Scotland.
That's right.
And after it became Police Scotland, you became the East Area
So after the amalgamations and we became Police Scotland, the previous structure that the SPF had was based on the old legacy forces. So the SPF had to change its structure as well. So I initially took up a role with Fife Constabulary. Fife Constabulary was no more. So when Police Scotland became, the structure as it remains today was kind of north of Scotland, the east of Scotland, and the west of Scotland. So my position changed from being solely responsible for Fife to having responsibility for the former forces that were based in the east of Scotland.
And what were they?
So they were formerly Fife Constabulary, formerly Lothian and Borders Police, and formerly Central Scotland Police.
So a much bigger area.
Much bigger area.
Your
yeah.
remit
Yeah.
covered. And since, in paragraph 7 of your inquiry statement, since 2017, you've been assistant to the General Secretary.
Yeah, since 2017 I have responsibility for conduct matters for the SPF.
Right. And can you tell us, what do you mean when you say conduct matters?
So police officers' disciplinary matters are covered by regulation. So they're very different to normal employees. And I had responsibility for overseeing all of the conduct matters within Scotland, ensuring consistency, that what was happening in the north of Scotland was the same as the east and the west, making sure that the advice we gave followed the regulations. So really any police officers that found themselves the subject of complaints or disciplinary matters and sought advice from the SPF, it would have been ultimately my responsibility to make sure that they got the right advice.
Thank you. But to be clear, you remain a police officer.
Yeah. I remain a police officer, but I'm seconded from the Police Service of Scotland to the Scottish Police Federation.
So you're full-time with the Scottish Police Federation,
Yep.
but you still remain a police officer.
Yes, I remain a constable, albeit I'm not necessarily doing the traditional role that everyone would expect a response police officer to be carrying out.
And presumably you're not wearing a uniform
No.
or using equipment or any of that sort.
No.
And you work in the SPF offices full-time.
Yes,
Who's the General Secretary?
Callum Steele.
And you're his assistant?
One of there's
I was-
so there's a number of people who are assistants to the General Secretary. My role specifically is conduct. There's another individual that looks after health and safety matters. And there's another individual that has responsibility for equality. So the three, there's lots of other things that the SPF are involved in, but the three main subjects are have full-time officials looking after that particular portfolio.
So he has 3 full-time officials.
Yeah.
You personally deal with conduct.
Yep.
Someone else deals with health and
safety.
safety. And then someone else deals with equality.
Equality and people. I think equality and people, I think, is the job title for that.
Could you tell us who the equality and people assistant is?
So currently, it's James Thompson.
James Thompson. And does his remit involve things like equality and diversity, racial discrimination, that
Yep,
type of thing?
absolutely. All kind of employment diversity issues would probably fall into that portfolio. Whether it's him personally that would deal with it, but he would have responsibility for engaging with the service in relation to those matters.
So he would be the person to speak to if we wanted more information about that.
Probably, yeah.
And then, just for completeness, who's head the health and safety
So
assistant?
health and safety is Gordon Forsyth.
And what does his remit cover?
So I mean, it's all things, all things health and safety, trips, slips and falls, equipment. He has a say in things like shift patterns, and there's much more to health and safety than the usual. What initially springs to mind, but he would have certainly an involvement in all aspects of safety for our members whilst they're working.
So the SPF cover a wide variety of areas.
Yes.
And how many members does the SPF have?
Well, it's probably, every officer up to the rank of Chief Inspector is effectively automatically a member, so that's probably sitting, I know the numbers have dropped recently, so we're maybe sitting about the high 16,000 or thereabouts. It obviously fluctuates depending on...
And those officers can contact the SPF at any time?
Yeah.
Now, I think in one of your paragraphs, you say the closest equivalent would be a trade union, although you're not a trade union, you're
Yeah.
more of a a member organisation.
Yeah, we don't have the same rights as unions. Obviously, police officers can't strike. So we're not a trade union. But if you were looking for an equivalent, yeah, the SPF is a statutory staff association, probably most akin to a union.
And all officers who are members can seek advice from you, or we've heard that can seek access to legal advice through the SPF. Is
That's
that
right,
correct?
yes.
And then your motto is welfare and efficiency.
It is, yes.
And so are these really the areas that are covered by the SPF?
Yeah, I mean, it's welfare and efficiency of the service. So anything that, any consultation about changes that Police Scotland are looking to make, the SPF would be involved in that, given the numbers in our membership.
Right. And you've said in your statement there are 4 office bearers, or 4 senior
national,
office,
national
national office bearers.
Yep.
And national as in for the whole of Police Scotland?
Yeah.
Or the whole of Scotland?
Yeah.
And one's the General Secretary, Callum Steele.
Callum Steele, yeah.
There's a Deputy General Secretary.
That's right, yeah.
What's his name?
David Kennedy.
And then is there a chairman?
There's a chairman and there's a vice chairman.
And what's the chairman's name?
David Hamilton.
And the vice chairman?
Brian Jones.
Vice chairman or deputy chairman, sorry?
No, he's vice
chairman.
Vice chair. Good. No, he's vice chair.
He's vice.
Chair. He's vice chair.
So it's a deputy general secretary and a vice chair. I'm sure I'll get that wrong. Can you explain to our chair what the sort of remit of each of these, what the role of each of these positions encompasses?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's, under the old structure, I hate to hark back to the old structure, but it was probably easier under the old structure because we had, 8 separate forces. You had 8 chief constables, so each Federation Joint Branch Board dealt with the police managers from their force. When we became Police Scotland, we have 1 chief constable. We have a number of senior deputy chief constables and ACCs. So the 4 officials that you have, the national officials, they tend to deal with the chief constable and with the deputy chief constables on kind of strategic matters, and they're certainly that would be their role, leaving the areas to deal with much more of the day-to-day matters, but with the direct contact with the members for consultation and raising issues when things are not working as they should do.
Right. What does the General Secretary do?
Oh, that's probably a question for him. But Callum leads on many of the pension matters, pay matters. He is the leader of the SPF, so his name goes on much of the documents that are circulated. He effectively manages the organisation.
So you've described him as the leader of the SPF. Is he the most senior office bearer?
Yes.
And in terms, you've talked about having 3 assistants, yourself on conduct,
yep,
and Mr. Thompson on equality.
Yep.
Do you speak to Callum Steele as General Secretary and seek his approval or his authority for major decisions that you're making in your role? No,
so I suppose that's one clarification. The decision making of the SPF is the responsibility of a joint central committee.
Right.
So clearly, recommendations or suggestions would be made to the joint central committee. And the joint central committee is made up of I'm trying to think how many people are on it, maybe about 24, 25 people from around the country. Some of them will be local representatives and some of them will be full-time representatives, and that's the decision-making body of the SPF, not Callum Steele. But many of the recommendations and suggestions that are put to the Joint Central Committee might come from him or might have come through myself or any of the other portfolio holders.
Wherever the ideas or the projects or suggestions come from, are they filtered through the leader of the SPF, Callum Steele?
It's as a committee, but Callum is at the top of that committee. Yeah.
So he's at the top of that committee, and there's about 24 or 25 people on the committee. And you said there was lay people as well. Are they appointed to that role?
Yeah, you get elected to that to the Joint Central Committee. So so there are set numbers that represent the east of the country, the west, and the north to make sure that it's fair and equitable around the country.
And they're the governing body, so formal decisions that are taken have to be approved by the committee.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. But the General Secretary is on the chair of the committee, is he? And the other office bearers, are they also on the committee?
Not again, only if they're elected, so not all the office bearers are there. They get elected by their area committee.
Okay. Now, so can I ask you whether there are any issues? Obviously it's a matter of public knowledge that Callum Steele's been involved in potential misconduct proceedings from Police Scotland in relation to tweets connected with this inquiry and the events in Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May. And I'm interested in whether that causes any conflicts or issues to arrive in relation to the Joint Central Committee and his position as General Secretary.
I'm trying to think whether there's ever been any discussion about that at the Joint Central Committee, and I don't think there has been. I think Callum was tweeting as an individual. He wasn't tweeting from the SPF account. Right. I don't remember being part of any discussion about that, if I'm being honest.
So that's not been raised at any of the committee meetings or discussed at any of the committee meetings?
I don't think so, no.
Right. And then in relation to engagement with the media, who's in charge of that in SPF?
Do you know, I got asked this question specifically prior to this, and I believe that that's probably the role of the chair, but that's just because what I've seen go out from the SPF tends to be in David Hamilton's name currently. I'm not sure that I've been part of any discussions about particularly who's responsible for that. I would expect that it would depend on what the media matter is about and who's probably best placed to speak about it, but it's not something that I've ever been involved in personally.
But if we wanted to try and find out more information about that in the future,
probably
David Hamilton
or Callum Steele would probably be the best people to ask about how that's dealt with in the office. I'm not sure.
So either the General Secretary, Callum Steele, or the Chair, David Hamilton.
I think so.
Thank you. Can I ask you, when you became a representative for the SPF, and also when you got your new role in the SPF and became elected, did you have any particular training for that role?
So no, not to become a kind of local representative. And if I'm being honest, when I first became involved with the Scottish Police Federation, it was with a view to trying to get information. It's difficult sometimes, particularly everybody's interested in their pay and when your pay rise if you're going to get ones coming out. And I suppose I got involved with that because it was frustrating that information didn't seem to be coming out quite quickly enough and spreading through my colleagues. So that's why I became involved, to find out information and to share it with colleagues. Mm-hmm. So initially it was just an interest in the workings of the organisation and being involved in helping colleagues. So to begin with, absolutely, no training other than having been a police officer for a set period of time.
So you've mentioned in paragraph 4 of your inquiry statement, you were elected as a local rep after about 10 years.
Yeah.
So would that be about 2002?
Yeah, that would be about right, yeah.
And that was roughly the time you wanted to become more involved with SPF. And then you were elected as a full-time office bearer 2012, which would be another 10 years.
Yeah, so during that time, when you're first elected as a local rep, you get sent on some local or basic training courses at the SPF arrange, which are generally round about the kind of police regulations, rights in terms of the questions that people want to ask you, which is how much am I entitled to claim if I get held, if I have to work a rest day or if I have to work on a public holiday. So there was training provided, but not until I was an elected local representative, because that training was provided by the SPF.
All right. Was there any particular training at that time on situations where there may be potential criminal allegations against the police?
I think at the time when I was a local rep, no.
No.
I wasn't trained early doors in kind of conduct or legal matters.
Well, when you were elected as a full-time office bearer in 2012, was there any additional training provided to you at that time?
Yeah, I received training in respect of health and safety matters, and training on the conduct regulations, which had changed in 2014.
And you received that after 2014, after they changed?
Yeah, just as when they were introduced, yeah.
Did that training include considering situations where there were potential criminal allegations against the police?
Yeah.
And had you had any training by May 2015 in relation to post-incident procedures, post-incident management?
No, I attended post-incident training at the end of May 2015, so after this incident. I was aware of the process, but I wasn't trained in it.
Right. And when you said that you'd had training in relation to potential criminal allegations against the police, what did that training involve?
Well, it involved the SPF explaining our legal advice and assistance scheme and how that worked for police officers who were members of that and seeking to access legal advice, and it covered very it's not in any way, shape or form legal training, but it providing a bit of advice in respect of providing statements, probably more for complaints against the police as opposed to criminality.
Right. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 33, please? Just to clear something up for me. I don't know, this is your inquiry statement, I don't know of any training particularly related to criminal allegations about the police.
Yep.
I'm wondering, that sounds a little bit different to what you've just
told
us.
So I think what I was saying there is that I think I'm talking about Police Scotland training.
Oh, I see.
And what I'm saying is I don't know if Police Scotland provide any training in respect of that, because I then go on to say between 2013 and 2018 I didn't have access to Police Scotland, so I wasn't able to to access the intranet and to see what information Police Scotland was necessarily putting out to its staff and to its officers. So I think paragraph 33 might be in relation to training provided by Police Scotland.
As opposed to
the SPF.
And you say there between 2013 and 2018 you didn't have IT access to anything to do with Police Scotland. Why was that?
I think mainly because in 2013, the SPF, certainly the office that I worked in, moved out of a police building and moved into our own accommodation. And previously I had been able to access Police Scotland's computer system because I was based in a police station. So it was very easy just to go down the stairs and access the internet and see what information. Once I had moved out and was based at an office in Livingston, we didn't have any police computers. The IT was all SPF IT, and I didn't have. I lost my my log-on information, if you like. It expired, and it took until about 2018 to get that back again and get a kind of laptop that we could access it. So for about a 5-year period, I didn't have access to my email, my Police Scotland email, or the intranet. I mean, people could still contact me because I had SPF contact details, but it did make it a bit difficult. When new guidance came out, you were relying on members making me aware of that if that was something that we needed to know.
We've heard a bit of evidence that, as you say, people get emails, they get guidance, they get information sent to them through Police Scotland. We've heard about SOPs being available online and forms being available online and things changing on a regular basis. So during that 5-year period, you didn't have any access to that at all?
No, I mean, I would be aware of many of the SOPs because they would be sent to the SPF for consultation. I just wouldn't necessarily have ready access to be able to go in and access that document. But I would be aware of them because the SPF were a statutory, have to be consulted for the introduction of SOPs. But at that time, there were hundreds of them, and many of them had hundreds of pages. So the only way that you could keep up to date would be going in regularly and reading them.
But you didn't have access to that?
I didn't have access to that, no.
And although you were consulted in them, obviously with these processes, you'll be consulted in maybe a draft version. But when the final approved version was created, that would be on the Police Scotland's website, and you don't have immediate access to that.
I wouldn't.
So unless someone was sending that to you specifically, you wouldn't have access to that.
No, and there were occasions where I did ask for an up-to-date version of a SOP because I was perhaps using it or looking to seek information from it to make sure that I had the right version. If I was assisting someone with a conduct matter, there was a way to get that emailed to me, but I didn't have ready access to get it myself.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 34, please? So it says, in May 2015, I was aware of post-incident procedures, but I hadn't been trained. I attended the Police Scotland post-incident training at the end of May following Sheku Bio's death, but at the time I wasn't trained. I was aware of the process, but I hadn't formally attended any training on it. What do you mean you were aware of the process?
So I was aware of the post-incident process. I just had never attended. I had never received any formal training. So I was aware that the process existed. I was aware that it was used probably at that time mainly for firearms offences. But I had never been called out in respect of a firearms incident, and I had, probably because I wasn't trained, and I didn't go on the training until the end of May, which was the Police Scotland training.
So you were aware that there was a firearms process in post-incident management, but you'd not had any formal training? No, I mean,
I was aware of what the SPF's role in that process was, but I had never never attended the training.
And then paragraph 37, if we could look at that. you say the incident on the 3rd of May 2015 was the first time that I had attended at a police station where there could have been a death in custody, a death in contact, if you like.
Yep.
I suppose the main source of my advice would be people either coming into my office to see me after the fact, or it would be over the phone. So no, this was different, absolutely. This was the first time that I had called, or had been called out for that type of incident. It was the first time I was called out when something was happening spontaneously and it wasn't after the fact.
Yeah.
So this was in fact, on the 3rd of May, this was in fact the first time you'd ever been involved in something like this.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the first time I had been called out, but it was the first time I'd been called out in respect of something like this. You know, we get called out the weekends and evenings, unfortunately, when there's a death of a police officer. So I had been out dealing, unfortunately, with more of them than I would have liked. But this was the first time that I attended in respect to something that had happened spontaneously.
And the first time there'd been a death in custody?
Yeah.
Of a suspect or a person who was
Yep.
involved in an incident. And then paragraph 38. So I suppose since that particular incident on the 3rd of May 2015 and the position that I've now taken up with SPF is that you're assistant to the General
Yeah.
Secretary.
Yeah.
I coordinate for the SPF who would attend at deaths in custody. We have a process now which we perhaps didn't have at the time. I deal with that with the SPF, so I've got probably a fair bit of experience now in attending deaths in custody, deaths in contact, post-incident procedures. So it sounds like things have changed since the 3rd of May 2015.
Absolutely. Since 2015, Police Scotland have a process now to deal with deaths or serious injuries that are not connected to a firearms incident. That there was always a post-incident procedure in respect of firearms or discharge of a firearm. But there wasn't for everything else or anything else.
A non-firearm matter.
Yeah, so they've now adapted the process that was in place for the firearms staff to take cognizance of all other, I think they call it DSI, so deaths or serious injury, and there's a process in place now. If that happens, I mean, I say it's not identical because they are different. If a firearm's used, it is different, but they're very, very similar processes now that would be put into action if there was a death or serious injury.
And that's been formalised by Police Scotland?
Yes.
And have you had training on that from Police Scotland or from SPF?
So yeah, I've now attended the post-incident training, and I've been involved in the creation of the SOP in respect of that and the guidance. So it was very much involved in that process being put together for death and serious injury.
Right, thank you. And then can I ask you about the morning of the 3rd of May 2015? So if we could look at paragraph 49, please. And you say you received a call from Austin Barrett, a local representative at Kirkcaldy Police Office. Yep. And do you remember much about the call?
Yeah, I mean, all I remember is it woke me up. I was still in bed. I wasn't expecting to be working.
It was your day off.
Yeah, it was my day off, and I wasn't actually on call for the East area. I wasn't responsible for the out of hours calls. But again, because I was a Fife officer, I joined Fife Constabulary. Lots of individuals in Fife still have my telephone number. So I got a direct call from Austin, basically making me aware that something had happened, and that he really wasn't very sure what he should be doing, or whether he should be doing anything, and seeking me to come and help.
Did you know Austin Barrett at that
Yeah,
time?
I didn't know him well. He was one of the local reps. I knew who he was. He had my number. So he's not someone that I know well, but I knew him.
How experienced was he at that time?
Do you know, not very experienced. I mean, I think he had a bit of police service, so he wasn't brand new, but he hadn't. I don't think he'd been a rep for very long at that point. So certainly the impression I got was that he genuinely wasn't sure.
But by then you'd had some considerable experience.
Yes, yeah.
And so he reached out to you.
Absolutely.
To get you to help.
Yeah.
And as a result of that call, you then decided to attend Kirkcaldy Police Office.
Yeah, well, I made some calls to colleagues because I wasn't the person that was on call, and I just wanted to make sure that there hadn't been an official phone call from Police Scotland calling someone else out, and then we both turn up. But as it transpired, that was the only call that the SPF got in respect of this matter. So no one else was aware of the incident.
So at no time did SPF actually receive an official call from Police Scotland to seek the assistance of SPF for their officers?
That's correct, yeah, no call.
At any time on the 3rd of May?
No.
So if Austin Barrett hadn't taken the initiative to phone you, there hadn't been any approach?
No, well, there might. I mean, I don't know whether my attending and introducing myself meant that was a tick in the box that someone could put later. We'll never know. But yeah, I think he absolutely did the right thing by phoning me at that point. Yeah.
Who was the person on call? Who should have been contacted at the SPA?
Yeah, well, it was Brian Jones, who's the vice chair. He was on call that weekend.
That day. Mm. And then in paragraph 54, you say that at that time you lived 10 to 15 minutes from Kirkcaldy and you went along, and you've had cause to maybe regret going along on that day. Yep. But as you drove to Kirkcaldy, you remembered various news articles, things on the radio. Yeah, well, I suppose Fife is an odd location, in that in my car at that time I only got Radio 4th or Kingdom FM were the two radio stations that you got clearly wherever you were in Fife. So that would have been the radio stations I was listening to. I probably preferred Radio 4th. So I think it was a Radio 4th news bulletin that had something on the news about a police incident. So I heard that travelling in. And apart from hearing some information on the radio, what had Austin Barrett told you? He, again, I'm trying to remember, I think he just told me that something had happened, that the man had died, and that the police officers involved had been taken back to Kirkcaldy Police Station, and they were in the canteen area. He was a bit concerned because they appeared to be there kind of on their own, nobody really taking responsibility for looking after them, and he was looking for me to come along and assist him with that. What time was it that you got the call from Austin Barrett? Do you know, I think I got there the back of 9, so I think he probably phoned me about the back of 8, maybe half 8ish. Your recollection now is that he told you the man had died? I think he said that there was an expectation that he wasn't going to survive. I'm not sure. I think we were certainly, after I arrived, there was confirmation that Mr. Bayou had died. But that came much later. I think Austin just told me that there was an expectation that it might not be survivable. Okay, thank you. And when you travelled to Kirkcaldy, you've said you arrived just after 9. What were you expecting your role that day to be?
Yeah, really just the welfare of the police officers, and looking to make sure that the police treated them fairly. They don't always treat police officers with the same courtesy and respect that they do with members of the public. So I suppose I was just there to make sure that they had all the information that they needed in order to get through whatever was going to take place that day.
Right. Can you help the chair understand what you mean when you say Police Scotland don't always treat their officers with courtesy and respect?
Yeah, well, so, Police Scotland don't always give cognisance that police officers have rights, have legal rights, and often look for them to provide statements to things where their status is perhaps unclear. I think there's an expectation that police officers will absolutely be truthful and will give as much information as they can. But when there's a suggestion of possible criminality, I think it can sometimes be forgotten by police officers, and police officers treat police officers sometimes differently.
Is that something you'd experienced previously in Kirkcaldy?
It's something that I've not just in Kirkcaldy. I mean, much of my experience was in fact I was a Fife officer. So yes, I've experienced it in Fife, but it is something that affects the whole of Police Scotland. You know, there are some individuals that seek police officers to provide statements about matters where quite clearly there's evidence that they're a suspect in a crime, with the expectation that, well, you're a serving police officer and you should be providing this information regardless, when they would never ask a member of the public the same question.
So a tension there between what the police expect of their officers and maybe the officers' rights not to incriminate themselves.
I'm not suggesting that this is it happens every single day, but there have been occasions previously where police officers have been asked. In fact, does a senior officer ever ask you for anything? You know, that's we are a disciplined service. So if a supervisor asks you for a statement, then most officers will do what they're told, and will then realise after they've perhaps submitted something that, yeah, I was a suspect there. I'm not sure that was entirely lawful, and I'm not sure that it was entirely right that I'd be asked that, but it happens, unfortunately.
We've heard some evidence about the hierarchy in the police and the different ranks and senior officers giving instructions or commands or whatever. Yeah, and there sometimes can be a bit of a blurred line there around what am I asking you for it? Am I requiring it? You know, police officers deal with legislation which is normally unambiguous. It's very clear. But dealing with some senior officers who, for all of the right reasons, that trying to get a hold of information, don't always consider that police officers have the same rights as members of the public. And in considering that experience that you've had in Fife, had you had that prior to 2015, or is this experience that you've had since? Oh no, it still continues to this day. But yeah, at that time, particularly in Fife, we were in an unusual set of circumstances. Believe it or not, if an allegation was made about a police officer, a criminal allegation was made about a police officer, Fife Constabulary would contact that officer, make them aware that there was a criminal complaint,
and give them the option of whether they should provide a statement. I'm just now that I know the lawyers in the room. I'll be blowing your mind here that happened, but it did, and that was still ongoing round about that time, or perhaps had just been changed just shortly before that. You know, Fife Constabulary was one of the areas that employed that particular process. Is that, you know, some you were asked whether you wanted to provide it, knowing full well that you were a suspect, and that anything you said would absolutely be used in evidence, and that didn't change till round about. I'm not sure exactly when that changed, but it was, you know, it was still ongoing in Police Scotland.
In 2015.
It might have changed around about 2014. I know that there was correspondence sent out to rectify that, because it wasn't just ongoing in Fife, it happened in other areas of Scotland. So clearly Police Scotland sought to ensure that it was the same national process throughout the country.
And do you have any recollection of when that correspondence was sent out?
Yeah, it was maybe just before this, actually.
Before May 2015?
Yeah, but in 2015, yeah.
And you've obviously told us you were aware of that, were officers, constables aware of that?
Oh, well, I suppose only those that had fallen into that, fallen into having a complaint made about them and perhaps been asked. So, no, not everybody would have been aware of that unless they had been caught up in the process.
Caught up in some manner?
Yeah, if there had been a complaint, or if there had been, they might have been asked for this and then sought some advice. It might have been, news to some of them that they would have been asked. I mean, there was no pressure put on them to provide it, but again, when it's an inspector in the police contacting you and asking you, am I being asked or am I being instructed? That's always the question.
And I suppose some officers will be more susceptible to pressure than others.
Yeah.
And so your role that day on the 3rd of May was aware of that situation to provide some support to those individual officers.
Yeah, and it was also to help, if there was going to be some post-incident procedure, and I didn't know that at the time, then it would be to do whatever I could to make the day go a bit. I'm not there to rock the boat or to cause any problems. I was there to help, primarily to help our members. But I remain a serving police officer, so I was happy to do whatever needed to be done, given the incident that they were dealing with.
So you were there to help the officers?
Yep.
And to support them?
Yep.
On behalf of SBF?
Absolutely, yeah.
And was their welfare more of a priority?
That was it was absolutely my primary concern, making sure that they were okay, and if they needed anything, to try and facilitate that through the service if need be.
Okay. And then we see paragraph 57 of your inquiry statement that Austin Barrett let you into Kirkcaldy Police Office when you arrived.
Yeah, Kirkcaldy Police Station's got keypads on the back door, and I didn't work there, so I didn't know the code. Austin let me in the back door. And
you went to the canteen?
Yeah.
And there were 8 out of the 9 officers who'd attended Hayfield Road in the canteen at the time you arrived.
That's right.
I think Nicole Short was still at hospital.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I knew that she was at the hospital. But she wasn't there at that point.
We've heard evidence that she was. So, would you be able to just, at that moment when you arrive at the canteen, explain to the chair the mood in the canteen, the way the officers were at that time?
Yeah, I mean, they were all really anxious. They were worried again, from my recollections, I don't think they had had any update about what had happened or what was ongoing, that they'd been in the canteen with kind of no feedback, no new information. So they were all a bit anxious, didn't really know what lay ahead of them for the rest of the day. I think they felt they were worried. You know, all being grouped together like that and not getting much information. So it was quite an anxious environment to walk into. They're all quite worried.
Did you have a sense at that time when you first arrived who was in charge of the situation?
Yeah, there was nobody in charge of the situation.
Was there any senior officers there present?
No, no. I think the most senior officer present was at that time Scott Maxwell, who I think was a constable but was the acting sergeant on that particular day. Yeah. He was the only individual above the rank of constable that I recall seeing, which is why I immediately went upstairs to try and find out what was going on.
Before we do that, can we look at paragraphs 50 and 59? You talk about going in and asking how they were, and then at 59 you say, I remember telling them on arrival that I'd heard the incident be reported on 4th News, and my concern was that members of their families and loved ones would be worried. Yep. I don't remember the specifics beyond what I've noted in my statement to PERC. That's pretty much my recollection. So again, were you trying to get them to contact their family members?
So yeah, that was probably the first thing that I encouraged them all to do, was to make a phone call home and tell their significant others that they were okay. You know, it's such a ridiculous question to ask someone, how are you? But that's what I did. But I told them to phone, not to give any details about what was ongoing, but because I was aware that there was information on the news. You know, my family would worry about me if they had heard that. So I thought, tell them that you're okay, and that in all likelihood you will be late home. You know, not to expect you anytime soon.
And were you aware at that time about a story about a female police officer having been stabbed?
Do you know, that was mentioned at some point, but I don't know where it came. I can't remember where it came from. I don't remember if it was on the. I think the news item was just about there was a police incident. It didn't give any more information than that. So I don't know whether that. I've been asked that question before. I don't recall being concerned about that at the time. I don't know whether that came later.
Okay.
When we were updated that there were much later on in the day that there were news items about someone being injured or stabbed, but I don't think I knew that at that early point.
Okay. And then you've said you had a conversation with Scott Maxwell. Yep. And you mentioned that 60, 61, 62, yep. And he gave you a brief summary of what had happened at that time. Mm-hmm. And then can I ask you, look at paragraph 66, please. And you talk there about the officers hadn't been updated. They'd been left within that canteen.
Yep.
Only with Austin Barrett kind of hanging around. It's not a secure part of the building, it's a thoroughfare. So people were coming and going. I left there to go and try and find out what was happening. And you then go on to say you went from the canteen up to the CID part of the building to try and find out what was happening. I remember Colin Robson. He was someone that I knew from my time within the CID. I think he was maybe the DI at the time. Colin Robson was there along with Pat Campbell, I think that's his name, said he was in charge. So that's Colin Robson said he was in charge.
No, sorry, Pat Campbell said he was in charge.
Sorry, Pat Campbell said he was in charge. Did you know what Pat Campbell's rank was at that time?
I think he was a detective super at the time, but he's not someone, I had never met him before, he's not someone that I knew.
But they were both in the CID area?
Yeah.
And you say at paragraph 68, I remember feeling that I was in the way. I think they were in the throes of trying to identify Shekubayo, so I left my business card with him, and that my intention was to go back and sit with the staff, but at that point I asked him whether the intention was to do post-incident procedures. My impression was that that hadn't been considered, hadn't been thought about, which I suppose is understandable when they were in the very early stages of trying to deal with whatever had gone on. And I left and went back downstairs and spent the rest of the time with the individuals on the ground floor. I'm interested in your contact with Robson and Campbell. And you've told us just a moment ago that no one was in charge. So was this the first time that you'd heard that Pat Campbell was in charge?
Yeah, well, when I say that there was no one in control of the canteen area, which I would have expected if you'd brought a number of police officers back to sit together, I would have expected someone to be there, even just to check on their welfare and make sure they were okay. But yeah, Pat Campbell, the superintendent, as he was at the time, said that he was the investigating officer.
Right. And they were trying to identify Mr. Bayo.
Yeah, that was the impression that I got. It was all a bit chaotic, and I just generally got the impression that I was in the way, and I absolutely didn't want to be slowing anything down or hampering their investigation. So I left my business card. I told them that my intention was to go back downstairs and make sure the cops were okay.
And what were you hoping would happen in relation to your involvement with the officers?
So yeah, I suppose telling him that I was going down to look after them or to remain with them, I was hoping that he would send along someone from Police Scotland that would do that job. It's absolutely their responsibility. So I was hoping that would be the case. I asked about post-incident procedures, given the nature of what the police were dealing with, and he said he would get back to me.
Right. So you've said my impression was that hadn't been considered, post-incident procedures. What do you mean by that?
When I asked if that was a consideration, I got a kind of not a startled look, but that's the impression I got was that was the first of him considering that might be suitable.
Who gave you that startled look?
Superintendent Campbell.
Right. So you got the impression you were the first person to mention post-incident procedures?
That was the impression I got. Whether that was the case or not, I don't know, but that's certainly what I felt.
And when you mentioned it and he gave you that look, what did he say about your suggestion, if anything?
I don't think he said anything. I think he said he would get back to me.
Right. And did he ever get back to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it didn't get back to me, but he got back to the group by updating us later. Yeah.
Right. And when did that later update take place? Again,
I wasn't recording times, which obviously I perhaps should have been. But that was a bit later on in the morning, maybe a bit mid-morning. That was at the update where he came in and confirmed that Mr. Bayo was deceased.
Was he on his own when he came in?
I think so. Yeah. I don't remember anyone else being with him.
Right. And he confirmed that Mr. Bayo had died.
Yep.
And was there anything else he confirmed at that time?
Now, so I don't know whether then Chief Inspector that was responsible for the post-incident procedures later on had arrived by then. So I'm not sure whether we were updated that was going to happen, or whether he was already there.
Was that confused? Your memory of that's confused?
Yeah. I'm not sure whether he updated us that post-incident procedures were going to happen, and then the Chief Inspector arrived, or whether the Chief Inspector had arrived and he confirmed we're going to do post-incident procedures.
So you've told us about Pat Campbell. You've mentioned the Chief Inspector. What was his name?
You know, that's when I've had a complete blank on what his name is.
You might remember later.
Yeah. Conrad Trickett, sorry.
Conrad
Sorry,
Trickett.
Conrad. Yeah.
So Conrad Trickett was the Chief Inspector.
He was the Chief Inspector at the time,
He
I think.
came in after Pat Campbell or before?
Not sure.
What did the Chief Inspector, Conrad Trickett, say to the officers?
Conrad, as I recall, introduced himself as the post-incident manager. He, on his arrival, he provided them with a conferring warning that he was, I think, was reading from a kind of aid memoir that he had with him, and explained that it was probably going to be quite a long process, and that he would need to go and find out what was happening, and he would come back and update them.
Do you remember the time, or roughly what time Conrad Trickett arrived at the canteen?
I mean, my recollection is about mid-morning, so he was there. So sometime between 10 and 11, might have been a wee bit later than that.
You've mentioned, and you mention it in your inquiry statement, a conferral warning.
Yeah.
What was that?
So it's part of the process, and they generally, post-incident managers generally read it verbatim off a kind of laminated sheet that they have, and it effectively tells those that are involved in the process that the whole point of this process is to establish your recollection of what's just happened. So warn against conferring with your colleagues, because actually we'll get their version of events. What we're looking for is what your honest, I think they call it your honestly held belief at the time. So it's just clarifying to them to say the reason that we're looking for you not to speak about the incident is because we're looking to get what you recall, as opposed to a mixture of what other people might have said to you.
And prior to Conrad Trickett coming in, you thought about mid-morning. Had anyone spoken to the officers and given them a conferral warning or a conferring warning? So
I don't believe that had happened prior to my arrival. Now, I didn't provide the proper conferring warning, but on my arrival, I just sort of made sure that there was, I didn't give them a warning, but I explained to them that the whole point of this process is about what they're looking for is your recollections, so please don't talk about what happened. I don't need to know. But I don't believe that they'd had that from anyone else. No, certainly nobody mentioned that they'd already had it from someone else, and that's probably because there hadn't been a decision made on post-incident procedures, I expect.
You didn't have the laminated aid memoir.
No, but I understood.
But is that from previous experience?
No, just roundabout going. Let's not talk about anything that's happened until the process is kicked off.
Okay. And did you have concerns in the morning about the way things were being handled with the officers in the canteen from an SPF perspective?
Concerns? No, I wouldn't put it as concerns. I suppose it's always a bit disappointing when information's really slow in coming forward, but it's absolutely to be expected when there's an ongoing spontaneous investigation. So I wasn't worried about it. No, I suppose I had a specific job to do, and I was just keen that I did that, despite perhaps Police Scotland not looking after them themselves.
And you said earlier that Police Scotland absolutely had a responsibility. Was that a responsibility to consider the welfare of the officers, or some other responsibility?
No, I mean, I think that they are self-serving police officers. Their only involved in this incident because they turned up for their work that morning. I just think it's right and proper that Police Scotland look after them and provide them with all of the information that they might need. And if you're not there, how do you know what anybody needs?
So what would you have liked Police Scotland to have put in place in the morning to support those officers?
So someone should have been with these officers from the minute that they come back to the police station.
And when you say someone, what sort of person are you thinking?
Well, you know, anyone not connected to the incident, preferably a supervisor, because that holds some gravitas in the police. You know, rank matters, whether we like it or not. So I would have preferred that. That isn't always possible when things are ongoing and people need to be seen. But I'm not sure that them coming back to the police station and sitting in a room where there can be a suggestion that they have spoken about this is looking after them.
And what could that supervisor have done for the officers if someone had been there? What could they have done?
Just ensured that the kind of principles of the post-incident procedure, even before it started, have been maintained from the outset. If that makes sense.
Maintained and observed.
Yeah.
Can we move on to paragraphs 72 to 81 in relation to Nicole Short?
Yeah.
And you describe her arriving, and you have been referred to your previous statement 237. It's quoted in paragraph 73, so I won't go to that immediately. And you say around mid-morning, Constable Short returned to the police station from the hospital. And then on to the next page, please. About 10:30, she arrived back, mid-morning. That seems right to me. Was that before or after Pat Campbell came in?
Don't know.
Okay. And you've said there, I don't know if she was wearing her body armour or officer safety equipment, but she had it with her when she came back. I didn't see her wearing it. So in the canteen, she wasn't wearing it.
I don't remember seeing Nicole wearing her body armour.
Right. And then there was a bit of a huddle around her, you say, in 75, and then you describe her at 76. She was a poor wee soul.
Yep.
And you say she was very stiff on her upper body. When she was turning around to see you, her whole upper body was moving. She was white as a sheet, not really taking anything in. It was a wee shame. I was quite worried about her. Everybody else seemed to be well, just a bit not really sure what was going on. And then you're asked at paragraph 77 about your previous statement.
Yeah.
Which said, I inquired as to how she was feeling, and she complained of feeling sore around her head and neck. Presumably it was obvious from what I could see that she was not comfortable and in pain. I didn't know what injuries she'd suffered, and you asked how she was.
Yeah.
And then at 78, you say she wasn't able to move her head to the side. So when she moved her head, she was having to move from the waist, if that makes sense. She was moving her entire upper body, so it looked like she was uncomfortable. And then at 79, you're referred to your later PERC statement, which was 22nd of June, and you describe her there, and you say she was very stiff about the chest and neck.
Yeah.
And appeared to lack focus, appeared shocked, and you thought she might have been medicated, but she wasn't. And when I spoke to her, I gave her the same advice I gave to the other officers about status and statements. And I think I had to explain this a couple of times as it wasn't registering or sinking in. And that's what's written down in the statement. Now, we'll come back to the injuries side of things in a moment. But looking at paragraph 79, you've said you gave her the same advice you gave the other officers about status and statements. what advice did you give the other officers?
So the advice that I gave to the officers was, at some point, someone who's investigating may come along and ask you for a statement. What you should be inquiring is what your status is. Am I a witness or am I a suspect? If you're a suspect, then you probably want to seek some legal advice before you do that, because it really shouldn't be asking you for a statement if you're a suspect. And if they confirm that you're a witness, then I suppose that we never got to that part, but the next part might have been, are we doing that today? Is today the best day for that to be done, given what had gone on earlier? But yeah, it was as straightforward as that, of going, if you're asked for a statement, you should be asking, because they'll not ask me for it. I wasn't there. You should be ascertaining whether you're a witness or a suspect.
And depending on the answer to that question, there's different...
Absolutely.
A different approach recommended.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the advice you'd given the other officers in the morning?
Yeah.
Before Nicole Short arrived?
Yes.
And you repeated that for Nicole Short?
Missed it. Yeah.
Thank you. And then paragraph 80. It's been suggested to me that my account to PERC is different to what I wrote in the statement I produced. That was the original one.
Yep.
Specifically, in the first statement I said she complained of feeling sore around her head and neck, and in the PERC statement said she was very stiff about the chest and neck. And you see it's more detail because I was asked about more detail in the PERC interview. In my first statement I was asked to provide a very general statement. Could I have given more detail quite clearly?
Yeah.
And then paragraph 81, perhaps if I'd been provided at the time with a bit more guidance, I'd never been asked to provide a statement about my involvement. I believe they were investigating the death of an individual. I'm not sure that I would have gone into the level of detail that I was asked later. I answered questions when I was asked specifically about them. Could I have added it at the start if I believed it was relevant or helpful? Then I could have done, yes. So the first statement says head and neck.
Yep.
The second statement says chest.
Yeah.
Thinking back now, can you tell us what your impression was of the difficulties that Nicole Short had when she came back to the canteen?
Yeah. So when Nicole arrived back, my recollection is that if she was going to speak to someone, she entirely moved her body from her waist. She didn't turn her head. She didn't turn her. She turned her entire body. That's what I remember. You know, and it was the same if she was turning that side or if she was turning. I mean, I'm on a swivel chair. She wasn't on a swivel chair. I think she was sitting on the sofa. So my recollection is she was turning from her waist.
So avoiding turning her neck.
Yeah.
And is that the area where she appeared, to you at least, to have some difficulty?
Yeah, she appeared to have discomfort in her kind of upper body, which is why she was moving, I thought, the way she was moving.
Right. And she was avoiding turning?
Yeah.
Moving her neck left to right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in paragraphs 86 and 87, sorry, I should have maybe just confirmed with you there, Miss Givan. Do you remember earlier we talked about the paragraph that said, I'm not accepting everything in my original statement, I want to be clear what it is. So if there's an apparent discrepancy there, what would you suggest the chair should prefer between your first and your second?
I mean, there isn't much time between the first and second. I was asked in more detail at the second one, so perhaps the second one.
But generally, your evidence today is your best recollection.
Yes, my best
today.
recollection. Yeah.
Thank you. Paragraphs 86 and 87. You talk about the officers in the canteen being a bit fed up, I think, with the delay and the time things were taking. Tell us what impact that was having on people.
So, yeah, they were absolutely aware that there was a need for them to be there. You know, there was an ongoing investigation, but we were there all day. And there were times in that day where, with lack of information, people were a bit frustrated and, you know, couldn't understand why am I sitting here when I could go home? You know, what purpose are we serving by remaining here if nobody's coming and asking us anything or nobody's telling us what's happening? Could we do this elsewhere? So it wasn't all day, but there were times when, you know, there were nine police officers, myself and the two individuals that were doing the post-incident procedures. There were times where, yeah, it was a bit tense.
What information would have assisted the officers at that time?
Being told whether they were witnesses or suspects might have helped greatly.
Mm. Can we look at paragraph 88 first of all, to give it some context? You talk about Conrad Trickett coming in, and then at 89 you say Inspector Jane Combe joined us at some point late morning, I think. Jane was an inspector with Police Scotland that I know from my Fife days. I don't know whether she worked at Kirkcaldy or was brought in from somewhere else, but she was clearly asked to come along to help out Conrad Trickett with some local knowledge, and I think she knew some of the individuals that were there. How long was Jane Combe there?
So, again, I don't know when she arrived because I wasn't keeping a log when, you know, but that it should be in the log when Jane arrived. But she was there until the end. So Jane remained with us until everyone was effectively sent home much later on in the evening.
So if the chair had heard evidence that she only was in the canteen twice, the first time for 5 minutes and the second time with Conrad Trickett, but she stood behind him and said nothing, does that accord with your recollection? She
first of all, Jane Combe wasn't someone who was trained in post-incident procedures. Mm-hmm. My impression was very much that she was there to provide a helping hand. And I think she did leave on a number of occasions to attend the meetings that were ongoing or the updates that were happening elsewhere. But certainly my recollection is that Jane was there throughout. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the post-incident procedures often work where there's a post-incident manager and there are other individuals involved in that process. And the whole point of that is if someone needs to leave and go to a meeting or to find something out, then someone from that process remains. And I very much had the impression that Jane was carrying out the role of the appointed officer, which is a role within the post-incident procedures, albeit perhaps she shouldn't have been. But she was someone that was there when Mr. Trickett needed to attend a meeting or go to a briefing.
So she was the officer who remained while Conrad Trickett maybe left the canteen.
Yeah, if one of them left, the other one
would be present.
That's certainly my recollection of what happened that day.
And is that designed to provide that continuity?
Absolutely, yeah.
I'd like to ask you some questions about equipment. We've heard that at some point a decision was taken to recover equipment or clothing from the officers. Do you remember when that was?
My recollection is it was very late in the day. It was actually one of the last things that happened. Their equipment was seized. They were then all to see a doctor.
We've heard that was an FME.
FME, and then they went home after that. So I think they went up the stairs to get their equipment and their uniform seized. When they came back down, they went in to see the doctor, and then after that they could go home. So it was one of the last things that happened.
Right. And can we look at paragraphs 90 to 92? You see 90, the decision was taken that PERC wanted to seize clothing and equipment. And then 91, 92, you see at the end of the day, they were getting their uniform, clothing seized. And then they came down after that and they were examined by a doctor. There was a ridiculous wait on all of the police officers being examined by a doctor. So we had to wait for the doctor to come along, and then each of them went in, had a chat with the doctor, came out, and at that point they were able to go home. Did you feel that the delay in securing the doctor was unacceptable?
Yeah. I mean, it had been a really long day for them. Yeah, and I thought if this is going to happen, it could all have happened a bit quicker. It seemed an unnecessary delay, and we certainly weren't expecting clothing to be seized either. That was a.
And what concerns, if any, did you have about the welfare of the officers as a result of the delay and this happening?
Yeah. I mean, I was just really keen to get them home. It was quite clear at that point that they weren't going to get confirmation of whether they were witnesses or suspects at that point. So I was keen to get them home as quickly as possible, because they'd started at 7 o'clock in the morning, and we were now, it was dark outside.
Right. Did you feel by the end of the day that they had not had clarification of their status as witness?
Oh, they absolutely didn't have clarification of their status.
You're quite sure about that?
Yeah, I'm certain.
Right. And then can I ask you briefly, just before we move on, about the layout of the canteen? Now, there's different comments about this in your statement. So let's look first of all at 94 and 95, which are just coming up. Layout of the canteen. The back door comes into the car park, brings you into a corridor, male and female toilet, a flight of stairs that took you upstairs. You entered the canteen, which would have been a bit of an assembly hall. And then that open space was split into two by a kind of wooden partition wall, snooker table, dartboard, and on the other side, formal table, dining table, chairs, leather sofa with a TV on the wall. And then can we look at paragraph 42? And then it was located, the canteen was off the backyard. You accessed it from the parking area at the backyard, and you walked through the canteen to get to other parts of the building. I've walked through it, but it's the first time I sat down on a seat or a chair and actually was in the canteen area. And then can we look at paragraph 138, please? And do we see this is the only people that I know who came in were people passing through. I have no idea who they were. I don't work there. I don't even know if they work there. They were just there for that day. So there was people coming in the back door from outside, coming into the canteen, and then going out the double doors. That happened throughout the day. So people were using it as a thoroughfare continuously throughout the day. Could you give the chair an impression of what was happening in that canteen? We may have heard some evidence that this was designed as a sterile area. And I think the chair would be interested to know your impressions.
Yeah, so ordinarily, for a room that's been used for a post-incident procedure, it would be exactly that. It would be a sterile room where only those that came into it had been allowed in by the post-incident manager. But this was I suppose, a bit of an ad hoc arrangement in respect of the location, and that it had, there were two doors, one that led in from outside. So if people didn't know that the canteen area was being used for this particular purpose, there was nothing to stop them, if they knew the keypad, to come in, come through the canteen and then go out the double doors to other parts of the building. I think it takes you, if you go that way, it takes you through into where, for example, the custody area is or to other parts of the building. So my recollection is that throughout the day there were individuals coming either in from outside and using that as their way into the building, or were coming through from the building to go outside. Obviously, once they come through those double doors and they realised that we were there, there was a bit of a sorry and out quickly, but there wasn't anybody controlling who come in and come out, because the doors weren't, the outside door could have been locked, I suppose, but the internal wooden swing doors were not locked.
I was going to ask, was anyone in charge of who entered the canteen or who left the canteen?
That should have been the job of the post-incident manager.
Right. So Conrad Trickett should have been responsible for
he would be
organising
responsible for
that.
Yeah.
And when you say responsible, do you mean he would have appointed someone to?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't expect for a minute that he would have been escorting people. But if someone was, for example, looking to go to the toilet, he would be looking to make sure that they went and came back.
And you've described that in a number of paragraphs as a thoroughfare.
Yeah.
So people were walking through the canteen from who knows where.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I don't work at Kirkcaldy, so I don't know many of the people that were based there. They could well have been people that worked there every day, and that was just the normal route they took. Or they could have been, that there were, although we didn't meet them, there were individuals from the park that had turned up at Kirkcaldy and would perhaps be less familiar with other routes to take to get into the building. So they may well have been them, but I didn't know anyone.
And you say that was continuously happening throughout the day. Was that through the whole day from the minute you arrived to when you left?
Yeah, I suppose it got a bit less frequent as the day went on, but certainly in the morning, probably to between the kind of 9 to 5 hours when there's people there working. My recollection is that was fairly regular.
And we've heard that when the officers were in the canteen, that they left their equipment and clothing, sometimes leaning against a wall, sometimes on the floor, sometimes on a table. Is that your recollection?
So my recollection is when I arrived, nobody had, it's really cumbersome and uncomfortable, so most people had taken it off, and it was kind of round the edge of the room. Your body armour often falls over, so most people prop it up against a wall or a piece of furniture, clearly within their eye line, but once you've taken it off, they had put it to the side, and I think everybody had pretty much done that.
Thank you. Conscious of the time.
Well, we'll have a break for 20 minutes at this point. Yes, Ms Graham.
Thank you. I was just about to move on to ask you some questions about equipment and in particular Nicole Short's vest.
Yep.
Can we look at paragraphs 148 to 157 of your inquiry statement, please? And you've been asked a series of questions by the inquiry team about this. And you explain you can't remember when you first saw Nicole Short's vest. And when we say vest, we're talking about the
Body armour.
The body armour with the high visibility vest attached to it. And you rightly point out you don't remember if she was wearing it when she walked in to the canteen. And then you have indicated that you're going to struggle remember what the mark looked like. I remember there being a mark.
Yep.
I remember being quite satisfied that it was sitting where it was sitting because it was not rubbing up against anything. Is that the vest you're talking about?
Yes.
Where was the vest sitting?
So the vest was propped up against the wall. The wall that on the other side of that would be the kitchen area.
Right.
So it was zip into the wall with the back panel
Exposed.
Visible.
So the zip side, the front of the
Front.
vest, leaning against the wall with the back exposed.
And it may have been leaning against, the front of it may have been leaning against someone else's body armour, but the back of it wasn't touching anything else.
Right. And where was Nicole Short in relation to her vest?
So I think Nicole was sitting on the sofa, which would be, 10, 12 feet away.
Right. And it wasn't covered, so it wasn't being preserved, but there wasn't any likelihood that it was going to be damaged or rubbed off.
Yeah.
The mark first came to my attention at some point during that day. Do you remember when you noticed it?
No, I don't. I don't think I noticed it. I think it was pointed out, but I honestly can't remember how that came about.
Do you remember who pointed it out?
I think Nicole, but
Are you not certain?
I'm not certain.
And then you say 150, what I need to be very clear is that none of this was my job to preserve anything. I wasn't doing an investigation. But I can remember thinking at some point, someone is going to be interested in that, and it's probably sitting in not the best location, but not the worst location. That's really all I can remember. That's my lasting recollection of it. I don't have my investigator's head on. I wasn't planning to do anything with it other than being satisfied that where it wasn't risking any evidence being lost. Tell us what you were thinking at this time.
Yeah, so I suppose I had an expectation that the mark that was on the vest may have been important. So if at the end of the day there was an expectation that Nicole was going to pick that up and put it in her locker, I would probably have raised it at that point to make sure that somebody was showing an interest in it, or at least looking to examine it or take possession of it. But where it was sitting, it wasn't doing any harm. There wasn't any evidence being lost. It was within the room that someone was in all of the time, so it was unlikely that anything would happen to it. So I suppose I was satisfied that where it was fine for the time being. But if at the end of the day they hadn't had their uniform seized, I would probably have been looking to speak to someone to say someone might want to have a look at this, because nobody, other than the couple of occasions where individuals came in to update them on certain things, there wasn't any ongoing dialogue with the investigators, if that makes sense.
Okay. So you've said you would have spoken to someone. Who would that someone have been?
Probably I would have spoken to Conrad Tickett, because that absolutely would have been his job to then facilitate what happened with that.
He was the post-incident manager?
He was the post-incident manager.
Would you have spoken to the SIO, the senior investigating officer, at all?
I don't know that necessarily I would have done that, because that wouldn't necessarily have been my place. Conrad Tickett was the post-incident manager, so I would have raised it with him, with an absolute expectation that he did that.
Did you raise it with him?
No, I didn't, because the items were seized, so I was satisfied that it had been taken possession of.
So in terms of the timing between you noticing the mark and the items being seized, do you have any recollection of how long that was?
It would have been quite a while, because, as I say, the items weren't seized until much later on in the evening. So it was probably sitting there for hours.
Right. So you noticed it hours before the item was
Yep.
seized. And then there's someone who would have looked at it. Who are you thinking?
Whoever was investigating it, whether that was someone at Kirkcaldy, someone in Pat Campbell's team, or whether that was the park who had already been made aware were investigating.
So either a police officer
Yeah.
of some description or
Yeah.
someone from PERC
Yeah.
would have looked at it.
Yeah.
And why did you think it might be important?
Well, there was I was aware that Nicole had been assaulted. I don't know if I knew at that time much more about what had taken place. So I felt that was perhaps a relevant consideration. And if not, then no harm done, but better to have had it than not have it.
Right. And then if we can look at the next paragraph, please. You see, it looked like a dirty mark. It looked like dirt or dust. It wasn't paint or anything. It was a dirty mark. So it looks like that's what it had been made from. If I'm being asked to speculate, it looked like it was roughly the shape of a shoe mark, albeit you couldn't see specific tread detail, but it looked to be roughly the size and shape. It was a kind of long, thin mark, roughly in the shape of a shoe. And then 152, I might have spoken to Nicole Short about it, but I can't remember going into any detail. Yeah. So in terms of where the mark was, can you tell us?
So, yeah. So again,
would it help if I gave you a demo vest? Because you could maybe see the back of it.
It looked like it was on the luminous yellow part below the police sign. Ready. So
this is just a
sorry,
demo.
the content, the innards are falling out of this. So my recollection is it was roughly along here. So below the police
badge.
The police sign and here.
And you're pointing to the sort of middle. Is that between the two strips of?
Yeah, I'm going to be honest and say I don't know if this vest is if you're telling me it's identical.
It's the same size.
I couldn't tell you whether these reflective strips were there at the time, because my recollection is that it was on the yellow part.
Right.
I don't remember the shiny bits.
Thank you. That's fine. Thank you. And then if we can go down on the inquiry statement, Ms. Drury, when Ms. Drury's back her seat. And you talk about making a presumption about it, and then you've watched the BBC documentary regarding Sheku Bio.
Yep.
And that's when you first became aware that the stomp or the stamp was an issue. And you see, I would be lying if I said that was when I first became aware, but I certainly got a lot more information following that documentary.
Yeah, I'm not sure when I first became aware that that anyone had saw Nicole be stamped on or stomped on. but I do remember the documentary covering that part of it.
Is your memory of the documentary clearer than your memory of when you would have become aware?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's really difficult. They've all kind of started to, I suppose that's one, an issue, that there was that information out there, and I'm not sure whether I got it from the documentary or whether I knew about it beforehand.
Is it possible that the documentary was the first time you realised it was an issue?
No, absolutely. It could have been. It could have been. I'm not aware of any discussion on the day that Nicole was stamped on, because I had already said, look, let's not talk about this. So I don't recall that happening on the day. Whether I heard later on or whether I saw it on a documentary, I'm honestly, I can't be clear on that.
Did you watch that documentary on the telly?
Yep.
When it was playing live, if you like, rather than iPlayer?
Yeah.
And when was that? Do you have any recollection?
Oh, no, I don't actually. Again, it's been 7 years, but it was some time after the incident.
Right.
I'm not sure when that was first shown.
Okay. Then 155, I think the only conversation I had about the vest was when Nicole was going up to have her clothing seized. It was to make sure that she identified the mark to them. I believe that was the only conversation I had. I didn't see who seized it. Nicole went upstairs on her own to have that done, so I wanted to make sure that she pointed it out. Tell us about the conversation you had with Nicole Short.
So, as I've already said, Nicole was a bit, a bit confused generally that whole day. So I suppose I performed the role of the bossy Federation rep, where when it was Nicole's turn to go up, and she was collecting all of her equipment to go up and have that seized, I was saying to her, remember and point out this mark on your body armour. Again, I'm not there to carry out an investigation, but I am a serving police officer. So in my head, I was thinking you would want to know that there was something to be preserved, because that might impact on how you package it or look after it. Whether you arrange for it to be photographed before you put it in a bag. I wanted Nicole to make sure that information went to those that were seizing it, who I understood to be detectives from the major investigation team from Police Scotland.
Right. How long prior to Nicole going up the stairs did you have that conversation with her?
Oh, I think it's as she was picking up her equipment to go up the stairs. I'm saying to her, remember, when you get up the stairs, she wasn't filling me with confidence in her ability to retain information or remember it. So it was probably the last thing she heard from me when she was going up the stairs. I was as confident as I could be without accompanying her, which didn't appear to be an option, but I wanted it to be the last thing that she heard when she went upstairs. And
as well as speaking to Nicole, did you consider speaking to Conrad Trickett about it? If you weren't confident?
No, I suppose I was confident that it was being seized, so I didn't mention that to him. Perhaps I should have done, but I didn't.
Thank you. And then going further down, please, 156. You then sent the inquiry an email you had sent to your legal representative, I think, who was Peter Watson. Yeah. And that was dated the 11th of March 2022. And a copy of the email is attached to the statement, but also the content of that email is then transcribed in detail there at paragraph 156. Yep. So you talk about seeing Nicole on the sofa.
Yep.
She wasn't wearing her body armour. And then if we could continue up. Not long after she was back, a shoe or boot mark was seen by someone and pointed out to me. I recall it looked very like the same of a shoe or boot sole. Is that correct, what's said?
Sorry, I think it should be the shape.
The shape of a shoe.
So it was a kind of long
right
shape as opposed to narrower.
Right. And there wasn't enough detail to see tread or anything, but it was more than just a dark mark.
Yeah.
It was left to the side along with everyone else's equipment. When you say it was left to the side, what are you referring?
I mean the body armour.
The vest.
The vest, yeah.
Right. And I recall thinking this was clearly better than it being worn and possibly rubbing off.
Yeah.
Near the end of the day, when each person went upstairs to have their clothing seized, I reminded
yeah.
Nicole to point this out to whoever was bagging their clothing, as it probably needed to be photographed.
Yeah.
So at the time, is your recollection that you thought it should be photographed?
Yeah, I would have expected something like that, that if it was put in a bag, it might rub off, that it would be photographed either then or shortly thereafter.
So not photographed by forensic staff later, but photographed in advance of it being recovered?
No, I would have expected that to be done by the forensics.
Or by the
Yeah,
forensic
no,
people?
I'm not meaning that someone just take a picture of it on their mobile phone or something for confirmation it's there. I suppose it's an evidential process, so I had an expectation that would be part of the investigation.
And as far as you know, no one took photographs of it
I've got no
prior
idea.
to...
No, I don't think anyone took a picture of it. Certainly in situ when we were in the canteen.
Okay.
And I don't know whether someone took a photograph of it later.
All right, thank you. And you've been asked at paragraph 157 why this mark and the mark on the vest were not mentioned in your original statement or your PERC statement. And you've said, I didn't include it in the first statement because I only included the information I thought was relevant to my part.
Yep.
I absolutely wasn't asked about the footmark by PERC, and I assume that that's why it's not in it, because what's covered in that statement is information they asked for.
Yep.
I was asked specific questions about certain things. If they'd had asked me about it, it would have been included.
Yeah.
So PERC did not ask you any questions about a mark or having seen a mark in the canteen on Nicole Short's vest?
No, I had no reason to believe that it hadn't been successfully, and I suppose I still don't know whether it's been successfully maintained on the vest. She took it upstairs, handed it over. I expected that would be looked after.
And in terms of why it's never been mentioned in your earlier statements, and it wasn't mentioned until the email, that's just because no one asked you about it?
I suppose no one asked me about it, and I have to say it was, probably like another 100 things that happened that day that have turned out to be of no value. I had no idea that was going to be relevant, and I suppose I don't know why it's relevant now. Probably because perhaps we don't have it. I'm only assuming.
Don't worry about that. We'll hear of other evidence about that.
I had every expectation that because that had been pointed out, that it would be available.
So between you watching the documentary
Yep.
and the email, sending the email to Mr. Watson, how much time passed?
Years, probably.
Why did you wait years to send the email to Mr. Watson?
I was asked specifically about that.
Who by?
Again, was it perhaps Mr. Watson? Asked me about the shoe, the mark.
What did he ask you about?
Did I recall seeing a mark on Nicole's body armour? And I said, yeah.
Why would he have asked you that question?
I've no idea. I don't know whether he's spoken to some of the other witnesses. I didn't ask. I don't know.
Right. And he didn't volunteer why he was asking you or speaking to you?
Well, he was representing the police officer, so I assumed it was to confirm whether there was anyone else, and there weren't many of us in the canteen on that day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the email was from the 11th of March 2022, is that right?
Yeah, because it was quite recently I got asked that. I think, I don't know when that was, maybe the start of the recognitions or...
Right. So your inquiry statement began on the 31st of March, and it was the 11th of March that he approached you to ask you about this?
Yeah. Well,
or prior to the that
11th,
date,
yeah.
Prior to the 11th
Yep.
of March. And how long after he approached you did you then send the email?
No, I think when he's spoken to me, I've sent the email that at that moment.
That day.
I've just responded.
Did he phone you about this, or did he speak to you personally, or did he email you? Right.
Don't know. It probably has been either. Yeah. It's actually not even that long ago, and I can't. I'm not. I don't think it will have been in person. He's not someone that I see.
Your paths don't cross.
Yeah. So it's either been on email or a telephone call.
All right.
I'm honestly not sure.
Okay. Thank you. Can I ask you about paragraph 139? So we're going back slightly. I'd like to ask you about Chief Inspector Nicola Shepherd and what contact you had with her in the canteen.
So my recollection is that at the time, Chief Inspector Nicola Shepherd was probably the senior officer at Kirkcaldy. She was the kind of divisional commander at Kirkcaldy Police Station. And my recollection is that quite clearly, because this incident had happened, she had been called and was returning to work. I don't think she was expecting to work that day. I could be wrong, but that was my impression. And that Chief Inspector Shepherd came into the police station and she accessed the building the same way that I did. She came in that same back door and came into the canteen, and rather than walk straight through and go up the stairs to wherever her office would be, she stopped to speak to the officers who are effectively her officers. She was in overall responsibility for Kirkcaldy. And my recollection is that Chief Inspector Shepherd still had her coat and her bag. She'd literally just come in to the station, and first thing she did was want to check that everybody was okay. But as she was leaving, and she was only there for a brief period of time. She wasn't there long. But as she was leaving, she made a comment similar to, just as I was alluding to earlier, we'll get statements from everyone and then you can all go home. And I just felt that was entirely inappropriate, that she had just arrived, probably wouldn't know all of the information, and that, again, as a senior officer, as a chief inspector, I thought it was inappropriate that she would make a comment like that to some officers who, as I'm sure you've heard in our evidence, were very, very young in service. And I don't think that senior officers appreciate that they are a chief inspector, and perhaps some of the comments that they make can be taken exactly as they're said. So I was a bit frustrated that what I think was an offhand comment might have been perceived by those to go, well, I've been told by a chief inspector that I should provide a statement.
You've talked earlier about sort of subtle pressures being applied because of the rank of the person making the comment. Is that what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't think, because I know Nicola Shepherd, I don't think that's what her intention was, but I think the unintended consequence of that, it could have applied pressure to people saying there is an expectation that I do this, and I didn't think, under the circumstances that she was just in the door, that it was entirely appropriate, and I made comment of that to say, well, let's just wait and see, because These officers are all waiting to find out whether they're witnesses or whether they're suspects.
And did you say that when she was in the canteen?
Yeah, I've said I'm paraphrasing, but I've said something along those lines of going, yeah, Chief Inspector, can we just hold the bus? Can we just wait until we find out what's happening? I felt it was appropriate that I challenged the comment, so that those who might have felt pressured realised that it was inappropriate.
And what would you have preferred the approach to be at that stage from Chief Inspector Shepherd? Yeah,
I mean, I still to this day have no issue with her coming in and saying hello to effectively her staff, who she has a responsibility for their well-being and their care. So it was right that she let them know she was there and introduced themselves. But I do think that it was an offhand comment. Perhaps, we'll get statements from you, we'll get everybody home, and then she was going to leave, and it just didn't sit comfortably with me that was the tone of how it ended. So, yeah, come in, explain that you've been called out and that you're going to find out what's happening, and perhaps say something along the lines of, well, we'll find out what's going on, and we'll get the ball rolling, or we'll get an update for you. Really, what these officers needed to know was whether they were witnesses or whether they were suspects.
And when she came and spoke to the officers, did she say something about getting statements from everyone because the family of the deceased would want to know what happened?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Again, everybody was very aware that family members would be looking for this investigation to move on and get somewhere. So, I have absolutely no issue with that being the case, but I just felt that there was an added pressure, is probably the right terminology that you use, of going. It was an offhand comment, I think, but I don't think that all senior officers quite realise that their offhand comments actually carry quite a significant amount of weight with officers much junior in service or in rank.
Can I move on and ask you about some paperwork? Let's look at paragraph 164 first of all, which deals with notebooks. But before I go into the detail of that type of paperwork, can I ask you about your own note-taking? You mentioned earlier you weren't there as an investigating officer. And what notes did you take, if any, that day?
Do you know, I didn't take any notes. The information that I left with that day was everyone's name, their mobile telephone number, and an email address. I didn't write anything else. I didn't write times down because that wasn't my role. That's the post-incident manager keeps a log, and all of that information should be there. So I didn't keep a log or keep a notebook. I left with a single piece of paper that I wrote on I think I actually handed it round and asked them to write their name, their contact details on it, because I had every expectation that in the days that followed, I would need that information in order to arrange legal advice and assistance for them.
And once you'd, what did you do with that bit of paper?
So I updated our computer system, made sure that all the information I had was updated for the 9 individuals, and then I shredded it. I didn't keep it anymore. It was a loose piece of paper. There wasn't anything else on it, other than perhaps Conrad Trickett's name, number, and confirmation of his email address, along with Jane Coombe, was on it. But once I had that information on my phone, I just disposed of it.
And that's the people who were in the canteen?
The post-incident team, effectively.
Post-incident team?
Yeah.
There's been some evidence before the chair that Inspector Combe was a deputy post-incident manager. We heard evidence from her that she resisted that suggestion and felt she was there as a support to Chief Inspector Trickett.
Yeah.
Did you have any impression of her role that day?
Yeah, I mean, the the process is that you would have a post-incident manager and you would have as many other appointed officers who are effectively, they're all trained as post-incident managers, but they effectively deputise for the post-incident manager. So, yeah, I mean, I expected anyone in that room, while she's not trained to do that role, but that effectively was the role. So deputy, post-incident manager or appointed officer is actually the role within the process. That's what I thought she was doing. Perhaps she didn't realise she was doing it because she's not trained, but
that was your impression.
That was my impression.
Let's look at paragraph 164. You say, I don't think I gave any advice regarding the completion of notebooks. I don't remember specifically speaking about notebooks. Is that in relation to the officers in the canteen?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Right. And then regarding use of force forms, I advised them that there were other supervisors who were on duty who could fill out that information, who already had that information. So until they were advised whether they were suspects or witnesses, that they probably shouldn't complete that form. I did do that.
Yep.
And that's consistent with what you've said.
Yeah, I mean, it's had they been told that they were witnesses, clearly any information that they provide in forums or documents, it would all be relevant.
And you're saying there were other supervisors who were on duty who could fill out that information. Was it your understanding at that time that one use of force form could be completed per incident and a supervisor could complete that?
I'm not sure whether one would have sufficed for the whole incident, but certainly, you know, there's lots of occasions where these forums are required to be filled in, but perhaps the officer involved has had to go home because they're unwell or they've become injured. So there's flexibility within that process that allows someone else to fill the form in. So I had every expectation that these officers that were involved in this process, that they wouldn't be required to fill out this information when probably sufficient detail was available by other supervisors.
And when you say other supervisors, who are you referring to?
Well, I mean, I suppose everyone that was on duty that day when this happened was involved to some degree in this. So anyone that was on could have taken over that role, I suppose. So
anyone who felt able could have taken it on, or could it have been a more senior officer, senior to a constable?
Absolutely. I would have an expectation that if these officers were involved in something traumatic or dramatic or and they needed to be sent home, that someone else could fill that document if it was necessary to be done there and then. But they shouldn't be required to fill out a form when their status is uncertain.
And then 166, I have no idea about CS or PAVA forms. That's something you would need to ask people in Police Scotland. I think there's perhaps a form to fill in if you've used it in order to get a new fresh bottle, but I've never filled any of that in, so I don't know what the process is for that. And I certainly wouldn't be the one to give advice on that. So that's not something you had experience
No,
of.
I mean, obviously before I took up this job, I have used, or had been issued with PAVA. I've never used it, so like everything there are processes for absolutely everything in Police Scotland. So I have no doubt that there is a process and a procedure to fill in a form if you've discharged your PAVA or CS break in order to get a replacement bottle. I've never filled that form in. I wouldn't know where it would be, and I probably wouldn't be the best person. Had I been asked that question, I would have suggested that they perhaps speak to Scott Maxwell or another sergeant on a team if they needed more. They would actually have more information about how to do that than me.
Did any of the senior officers that you came into contact with that day in the canteen give advice to the individual officers about forms to do with CS or PAVA discharge?
No, my recollection is there was no discussion about notebooks, PAVA, use of violence forums, there was no guidance given by them that I'm aware of.
When you say use of violence forms, do you mean a use of force form?
Sorry, yes. Yeah, if there's any violence or any use of force forum, I think something that used to be called a Baton report, is what it was called years ago. So yeah, it's got lots of different names.
Okay. So when you say, I don't believe there's any requirements to fill out statements, notebooks or use of force forms, that was your understanding in relation to the events in May 2015?
Yeah, I don't believe there was any request or requirement made by anyone to do that before they left or before they were updated with what their status was. Yeah.
Not as far as you're aware?
Not as far as I was aware, yeah.
And then can I ask you about statements? We've heard about operational statements, witness statements. Did you have, you say there you don't believe there's any requirements to fill out statements. Can you distinguish between operational statements and witness statements, and any obligations on officers?
Yeah,
those?
There's not really any difference. I mean, the only difference between a statement and an operational statement is an operational statement is something that's happened when you are on duty. When you've been operational, you would provide a statement. There was no request. I mean, that's the whole point of this post-incident procedure, is to balance the clear requirement for an investigation with the welfare of those people that are involved in it. And I would have expected that at some point there was some clarity about where they sat in all of this. That, to my knowledge, didn't come.
Okay. You've been asked a number of questions and answered a number of questions in relation to perhaps differences between what some of the officers have said about the advice you gave and what you've told us today. Can we look at paragraph 177 first of all? And I think you've gone through every single possible discrepancy. And 177 relates to PC Walker's account. And what you've done is you've been asked about specific references from PERC statements by individual officers, and you've been asked if they differ from the advice you gave, and you've given an explanation. Now, I think largely your position on these is very clear for the Chair, but I'm interested in particular about Pat Campbell. Can I ask you to look at 198 first of all? And this is Detective Superintendent Patrick Campbell's account. And at 198, you say that you've been told that his account includes the following. Shortly before 11:30, the exact time I do not recall, I remember having a conversation with Constable Givan, the Federation rep. She expressed to me that the police officers were distressed. I informed Constable Givan that all of the officers were being treated as witnesses and she should reassure them. And at 199 you say that absolutely did not happen. I've been saying the whole point was to try and establish whether they were witnesses or suspects. If I'd been told by someone that they were one or the other, that would have clarified that question. But there was no clarity provided to me, or as far as I was aware, to any of the individual officers by anyone. That was why we were left in the kind of position of waiting. I was thinking, at some point, someone will declare whether they are witnesses or suspects, and that never happened. Had Pat Campbell told me that they were witnesses, then that would have moved me on to make a phone call to clarify that, and we would have moved on to whatever the next step of the process was. That did not happen. So I think you've been very clear today. You did not get that clarity throughout the whole of the 3rd of May 2015.
Yep.
And will you say if you had had that information, that would have moved me on to make a phone call to clarify that. Tell us about what phone call you would have made.
So I would probably have made, had there been clarity that they were witnesses, then I would probably have made a phone call to colleagues within the SPF round about whether, depending on when these statements were going to be asked to be provided, whether there was a need or a requirement for legal advice from anyone. That phone call never happened because we never got to that point, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And what colleagues would you have spoken to in SPF?
Yeah, well, probably David Kennedy, because David Kennedy, as the Deputy General Secretary, has responsibility on behalf of the GICC for the legal advice and assistance scheme. So I would have.
That's the committee.
Yeah, so I would have sought to speak to him round about who might have been the most suitable person if that was necessary. That would have been probably the first phone call that I would have made. I do now, but my phone didn't have contact details of any of the solicitors because David facilitated that,
right,
if necessary.
And you've mentioned a few points today about when statements would have been taken.
Yeah.
And what sort of factors would be going through your mind when you're thinking about when?
So the process that we now have is that police officers will provide, on the day, police officers that are involved in the post-incident procedure will provide a very brief outline of their involvement and be given some time, up to kind of 48 hours, in order to get their head straight, having been involved in something that's quite traumatic, and then a full statement would be provided. So I had no expectation that these lengthy statements would be taken that day, given what had happened. My expectation they would have been taken in the days to come, but I would have expected some clarity before we left round about what the plans were for that.
We may hear evidence at some point that there's a balance to be achieved.
Absolutely.
Between
Yep.
getting the statement noted early,
Yep.
close to the events, but also the officers being well enough and
Yeah.
mentally fit
Yeah.
to give those statements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we'd already been there for a really long time. People were tired, they were worried, perhaps not the best environment to be sitting down and starting what might be a really lengthy statement to note from them.
Mm-hmm. And you would also have, you say, when you spoke to colleagues at SPF, that would have been about securing legal advice if required.
Yeah, and probably there's no doubt in it. I've been a lot of these since then, but that was the first one. So I would have been looking for some reassurance that what I was saying and what I was doing was absolutely correct.
And then can we look at 201, please? I have been told that Detective Superintendent Patrick Campbell's account also includes the following. Prior to entering the room, Constable Givan informed me that they would not be providing operational statements. I informed her at this time that may be the case, however, I was still going to ask them to provide. And at 202 you say that didn't happen. I don't remember speaking with Mr. Campbell outside the room at all. I'm surprised by this account. Tell us about your recollection of what happened.
Yeah, I suppose I don't understand why Mr. Campbell would be having that conversation with me. He should perhaps be having that conversation with Chief Inspector Trickett. He was responsible for the post-incident manager. I'm surprised that there's a suggestion that I've spoken to him prior to him coming in, and I don't recall there being any announcement to anybody.
Do you remember having any conversation with Detective Superintendent Campbell prior to entering the room?
No, the only conversation that I had with Mr. Campbell was in the morning when I introduced myself. The next time I saw him was in the room. I didn't speak to him. I don't know him. I didn't speak to him on my own.
So you've told us earlier you went up to the CID
Yep.
room when you arrived,
Yep.
and you saw D.I. Robson and Pat Campbell. And then you've talked previously about Pat Campbell coming into the canteen when you were there. So do you remember any occasion when you were speaking to him prior to entering the canteen?
No, I'm struggling to think of a reason why I would speak to him on my own.
Right. And then can we look at paragraph 203? I have been told that Detective Superintendent Patrick Campbell's account also includes the following, which may be a short time after 11:30. I then entered the break room, all the officers were in, and I spoke with the officers as a general group. Is that the canteen?
That was the only location we were. Yeah.
Present at this time were the PIM and Constable Givan. I explained that in consultation with PERC, their status was that of witness. I told them that my intention was to obtain statements from them, their clothing, footwear and officer safety equipment. And then at 204 you say, that absolutely was not said to the officers at that time, it came much later. The whole taking of their clothes came much later on in the day, and that came as a real surprise to the officers. They were not expecting their footwear, their uniform clothing to be seized, because that very much changed the tone. So had that been said much earlier in the day, then they probably wouldn't have had that awkwardness and difficulty in trying to explain why it was seen as being necessary. Can you explain that paragraph?
Yeah, so that there was no discussion or mention that footwear, uniform, clothing, equipment was going to be seized until it was going to be seized. That came much later on in the day, and that I'm going to call it a request, but it's Police Scotland's equipment, so they absolutely can take possession of it if they want. But the footwear at that time, police officers bought themselves. Most police officers only have one set of footwear, so taking that effectively meant that Police Scotland may be able to provide them with new body armour and trousers, and they would have other sets of uniform. But the footwear meant that they would need to go and buy new footwear, and seizing of clothing very much, when I say change the tone of it, it very much fell into the suspect area, which upset a number of the officers by going, we haven't been told whether we're suspects or witnesses, we are clearly suspects, otherwise why are they taking our uniform clothing and all our equipment? So if that had come, as it suggested, that conversation would have been had much earlier in the day, and it didn't. It came as a surprise. It came as an unpleasant surprise at the end of the day, in trying to explain to police officers that regardless of how you feel about this, that is what's happening. Your clothing and your uniform and your equipment will be seized, and we'll worry about footwear and how you're able to perform your duties thereafter.
So regardless of what may or may not have been said, the taking of their personal footwear changed the tone and made it more like they were suspect.
I mean, it wasn't just the footwear. It was the fact. Yeah, it was the seizing of all of their equipment. It changed the tone, and it hadn't been mentioned in any way, shape or form throughout the day until we were told there are 2 teams up the stairs from the major investigation team, and you'll go up individually and you'll change out of your uniform and put on whatever clothing you've brought with you.
And when did that happen?
That was very late on in the day, certainly in the evening, just before because when they came downstairs, they then went and seen the doctor and they went home after that. So it was one of the last things to happen.
So any suggestion that it was part of a conversation or a discussion at 11:30 in the morning, that's not your recollection?
Absolutely. I mean, it may well have been part of conversations that happened out with that room, but it certainly wasn't part of a conversation that happened with myself and the officers being present.
And that was the canteen.
And that was a canteen, yeah.
Can we look at 205 and 6? You talk about it being the last thing before they went home. And then at 206 you said, I have been asked why Detective Superintendent Patrick Campbell has put this in his statement. My reason why is nothing that I want to put in this statement. But obviously we'd like to get as much evidence to help the chair as possible. And I wondered if you'd be willing to explain why you think there'd be such differences between your recollection and that of Detective Superintendent Campbell.
Yeah, I can't tell you why there's different explanations. You know, the whole point of us being there that day was to get to the point of providing information that would help in the investigation, and all that was required was confirmation of whether people were witnesses or suspects. If that was so easy, why weren't the officers told?
What is the reason why there's the differences?
I've got no idea. That's perhaps a question you might have for Mr. Campbell. I can't explain why he's saying that happened, and you know, I don't recall it.
It's that you don't have an explanation, rather than you have an explanation you're not prepared to see.
Yeah, I don't know why he's saying that happened.
Right. There's nothing else you want to add about that?
No, I don't think so.
Can we look at paragraph 207, please? This relates to Gold Group meetings. I've been told that the Gold Group meetings were informed that I had advised the officers not to provide statements. No, I can't be any clearer. I absolutely advised the police officers at the point when they were asked to provide statements to establish whether they were a witness or a suspect. In the event that that information wasn't forthcoming, then they shouldn't be providing statements until they knew what their status was. I wasn't at the Gold Group, so I don't know what was said and whether it was taken out of context. So if we do hear in the future that meetings were told that you had advised officers not to provide statements, that's just not a correct or accurate reflection of the advice you were given. Is that?
I mean, I cannot be clearer, and that it was about clarifying what their status was. That was the advice that I gave. Is that, you know, until they tell you you're a witness, they shouldn't be asking you for a statement. And if you're a suspect, there are other ways to obtain that information from you, and they shouldn't be doing it by way of looking to get a statement from you.
Then 208. We see, I've been asked if I know of any new guidance in respect of officers not having to provide statements with regards on-duty criminal allegations. I think this probably relates to the 2 memos the inquiry sent to me. And then I have been asked how I became aware of this. It certainly wasn't within the Police Scotland circles because I didn't have access to that. I think that's what you said earlier today. You didn't have access to the IT.
Yeah, so as I recall, there are 2 Police Scotland memos that clarify the Police Scotland position, and that we're not going to ask, you know, if someone is considered to be a suspect, we're not going to ask them for a statement. I hadn't seen the memos before, but I was absolutely aware of that change in process. The reason I didn't see the memos is for the reasons I told you earlier, that I didn't have access to the system.
And then 211. You mentioned the practice in Fife up until 31st March 2013, and even after they became Police Scotland, they would let police officers know that they were a suspect, but give them the option of whether they wanted to provide a statement or not, which didn't happen in the rest of the country. I think you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, I think it was an issue, if you want, in Fife, but there were other locations in Scotland where that was also the case, so that the sending out of these memos effectively put every location in Police Scotland on the same footing. So we had the same process happening everywhere, rather than some of the legacy forces still operating as they had been up until that point.
And then at 213, you were asked some questions about the contact you'd had with the officers, and you've told us about taking their email and not contact details. Yeah. What actual contact did you have with these individual officers between the 3rd of May 2015 and the 4th of June 2015? Now, the 4th of June is the date that we've heard they gave statements to PERC. So it's in that month after the events and prior to the officers giving statements to PERC.
Yep. So again, I don't know what dates they came in, but they all attended at Kirkcaldy Police Station in the days afterwards. I attended also for that. There were some administrative processes that I had them fill out. Legal, the longer we got away from the 3rd of May, and there appeared to be no clarity round about their status, the SPF provided them with legal advice and assistance, and all of that was then passed over to solicitors. So my contact with them was round about those that were fit and able to return to work. How do they do that without any footwear? Some of them were unable to get replacement body armour, so just some of the practicalities round about whether they could or should be back at work. Some of them, many of them actually went sick following it because they were unable to resume duties. So afterwards it became much more routine assistance about how they got back to work, and whether they would actually come back and work at Kirkcaldy, or whether they would be perhaps redeployed elsewhere. Was really the kind of contact that I had with them.
Looking back now, do you remember when they received clarity about their status?
No, I mean my recollection is that came much later, and round about the time where they then went. I think the vast majority of them attended at the Scottish Police College, and they had their statements noted by PERC at the date in June. 4th
of June.
Yeah.
And what would you have expected in terms of providing that clarity to officers? So some have mentioned expecting something more formal, some have given evidence to the chair they expected it in writing. What would you have expected?
Yeah, just probably a verbal reassurance would have sufficed if it was me. But I don't think. I'm trying to think whether there was any discussion about whether it should come in writing. I don't think I was involved in that.
So that wasn't part of your role at that stage?
No, not really. But would I accept from a senior officer them telling me that I was confirming that I was a witness or I was a suspect? Yeah, that would have been good enough for me. But they perhaps had different conversations with other people.
All right. Now we may hear evidence in the future to the inquiry about media engagement. But while I have you here, I just want to confirm, did you say earlier it was the chair who takes the lead on media engagement for the SPA?
Yeah, I think that's the case, but I think it's very much depends on what the topic is. There might be someone within the organisation that's better placed, but I think everything is funnelled through the chair or the general secretary.
So if there are media announcements to be made, are they on behalf of the SPF as the body, or are they, as you say, funnelled through Callum Steele?
Yeah, I mean they'll definitely come out from the SPF, but they wouldn't necessarily all have Callum Steele's name on it. They may have. Well, they could have anyone's name on it. You know, I suppose for conduct matters that I'm dealing with, I just have never been particularly confident or sure about that side of the of the role. So I've never been involved in that. So I just know that it's done by other people.
In deciding the approach to media engagement on behalf of the SPF, is that funneled through the committee?
Probably not for specifics. For specific things like this, for pension or pay, yes, the committee will drive that. I'm not sure who was involved in the discussions about what would or wouldn't have been issued. I wasn't. I saw them at the same time everybody else did.
So let's look at paragraph 70. Actually, we're going to go way back. Just to be fair to you, I think you said in paragraph 70, you made a phone call to David Kennedy, who's the Deputy General Secretary, to make him aware that this incident had happened, primarily because the press might seek some comment. And to be honest, I didn't want to be criticised that I hadn't told senior members of the SPF. So I spoke to David and made him aware where I was. This is when you were at Kirkcaldy Police Office on the 3rd of May. I told him I was there and I was waiting to find out whether there was going to be post-incident procedures in place. So on that occasion, it was the Deputy General Secretary that you contacted. So was it an option for you, at least in May 2015, as long as you spoke to one of the office bearers? Yeah, I mean, I chose David Kennedy because he had the responsibility for the legal advice and assistance and is more involved in this kind of area that we deal with. I could easily have made Brian Jones or I'm trying to think. Brian Jones was even in posting time. I'm trying to think back in 2015. You could have phoned Callum Steele.
I could have phoned Callum Steele, but I contacted David Kennedy because I knew that he would be the person that I would need to contact in the event that we required solicitors.
Right. I've got a few more questions about that, but I'm conscious it's just
stop for lunch at that point, or 2 o'clock.